more inclined to sort of go over that in later weeks, but for this week, shrugs. All right, so this week's assignment that is due next week, what am I saying, is the work in progress animation. I may tweak the like not eligible for resubmit thing, I don't know. But basically this should be start animating your piece. Hopefully by now you've all have something like pretty much started for that at least. And it should be ideally more than just blocking. So I'll show you kind of like on this, again, highly questionable walk that I've made last night at like 11 o'clock. Sort of what I'm envisioning as being like blocking versus like something a little bit more refined. And there's two things that I would like you to submit for this. One video, which is just your individual animations. So pretty much any scene that you've touched or worked on. This is what I'm going to be grading. The animations for the finals are, again, sort of graded individually for the actual animation itself. So I'm doing that also for the resubmits. But if you could just sort of compile, like get together with your teammate and just throw together a final cut of all of the animations that you have. Just so that when we're going over these in class, there's a little bit of context for, you know, what's happening in the scene. And we'll probably just go through and critique all of, like, the whole clip at once. But again, that's mostly just sort of for context. All right, so play blasts are totally fine for this. I'm going to say I added some, like, extra sort of notes about this. Please make sure that when you're play blasting, you render out at the full HD render size. I'll go over all of this stuff, just like another brief how to set up a play blast so it doesn't look super gross. And also do turn off all the unnecessary like stuff in your scene. So like joints, controllers, deformers, any other weird things floating around that wouldn't show up in a render. It just ends up looking a little bit cluttered and is kind of hard to figure out what's going on. That's pretty much that. Here's sort of like what, more or less like how I'll be grading this. So again, I have sort of different versions of like what I would qualify as exceedingly rough animation in the file that I have, as well as like an example of this, etc. All you really need to submit is, again, a compressed video of your individual animations. If this could be an MP4 or MOV instead of an AVI, that would be lovely. And again, the compressed video of the sort of full shots that you guys have been doing, cut together so people can tell what's happening. So 2 video files for this, and that's pretty much all you need to turn in. Are there any questions on this particular assignment? Yes?
Do the camera angles have to be exact for this?
No. I would say try to get them like kind of close to what you'd be doing. But yeah, I mean, if they're not totally perfect, that's fine. Any other questions? Cool. All right. So that's the only thing due next week, and I think pretty much from here until the final is basically just assorted work in progress assignments. And then, just as a reminder, so like all the, I don't like this new sidebar, it's very gross. It's just like a weird reminder. I do have all of the stuff that's due finals week just thrown up here on Learn. So you have like the demo reel, the sort of submissions for the final itself, and then also submissions for the robot textures, room models, and room textures. So again, if you guys are looking for them, want to submit them early, they're all just in the finals folder because that's when they're due. If you do want to submit your robot textures or anything like that early, I will be happy to grade them early, and then you can pretty much just resubmit up until finals day. So if you get something done, it never hurts to throw it up early for some extra feedback. All right. Any questions on any other random sort of assignment things? Cool. I think I did actually. Oh yeah, I did, for whatever it's worth, I linked this sort of general formatting doc thing here. It's the same one linked at the bottom of all the assignments, but this just goes over all the different settings for like renders, videos, playblast stuff. Basically just like how to format playblast. I'll go over all of this nonsense again today. But that's there if you guys want that. All right. And if anyone is interested in actually following along with whatever I'm doing, I threw up in the Google Drive. That sounded weird. If you go into the student resources sample models Maya files, I have this little folder for robot caricature walking. And I just have 2 files in there. This is the one with the actual animation, the Quick Walk version 2.5 layers 2. And then this one, this I referenced in, so you should also download this one if you're gonna download this and play with things. But again, those are up if you want to play with them. Blah. Here is the crappy robot walking animation. It looks really janky. So when I say that, all right, so it's totally not this fast. Just for the record, if your animation's over playing like faster than you expect, actually, can you guys all see that, or do you want the lights turned off? Okay, sweet. This room is actually like not totally horrible with light, I feel like. But if your stuff ever plays like really, really fast, like this is kind of doing, this is like not even super extreme, you can just right-click in your time slider and do playback speed. And you can do, for this one, I'm just going to do real time. I don't care if it skips frames. Like, it's not a sim. It's not going to really make a difference. And that should play at like the actual, more or less like the actual speed that it's walking. So this is, like I said, my extremely janky walking animation, which I did at 11 o'clock last night in 20 minutes with no reference. So, yeah. In context of the assignment, what I would qualify, so I've thrown in some animation layers here. I'll go over those, I guess, in a little bit, if you guys are curious. It's like display layers almost, or like layers in Photoshop, where like you can add animations per layer, and then you can like turn them on and off. So you can see, like, as I sort of mute or unmute this better pelvis layer, it's actually changing the position of the pelvis. Again, not super important and not really necessary to animate. I just used them for a demo. So, purposes of your assignment for your work in progress animation. This is something that I would qualify as like one of the sort of lower like 0 to 3 grades where it's like really, really rough. All I've really done with this point is some walking with the feet. I've done literally nothing to the upper part of the body except put the arms not in T-pose, but like they're just following directly along with the pelvis. So again, this is like fairly rough. You can see that there's a lot of sort of IK popping in the legs where they're sort of flipping out. Let me see if I can, all right. So this is stuff that just in general that you would want to sort of avoid in rough animation is not the end of the world, but like in your final animation. Stuff like this, if you look at this leg, so as it's bending, it's extended a little bit too far, and you can kind of see in this one frame where, like, do you see how that leg is sort of like almost hyperextending? Like really, really aggressively, and then it's sort of moving forward, and let me just go into a side view that would make everything easier. You can see that it's sort of like, 5 seconds. I'm determined to make this actually visible, and then we shall proceed with things. Huzzah. All right. And you can see where like that foot is trying to hit the ground, like right here, but it kind of can't because the pelvis isn't far enough forward. And that's just because the IK leg is stretching too far. So there'd be a few different ways to fix that. All right, display layers. Pretty much all you'd want to do is actually just move the pelvis forward a little bit. You can see that like once you do that and you shift it forward, the leg is able to actually connect with the ground, and then any kind of weird IK popping that was happening in the leg is pretty much fixed automatically. So that's fairly handy. And also like is pretty much how you fix IK popping. You just need to go through and just sort of like look for it, make sure that nothing is stretching too much, and you can usually just shift the pelvis around or something else slightly so that the arm isn't hyperextended. So that's, again, kind of example of like very, very rough what I was looking for. Kind of like minimum expectations for the block animation. Anybody have any questions about that? Cool. So you can see as I just sort of systematically turn on some of these animation layers that, again, the pose gets maybe a little bit more dynamic. So I've done some stuff. I'll show you all of these sort of separately. But this is like more or less what I would expect for like medium high-ish grade, where I'm not, like I said, this is not an example of good fluid animation. But you can see that like the attempt of getting a little bit more dynamic motion is there, like the feet have a little bit of sort of back and forth sassy motion. The pelvis is, rotating back and forth, has more rotation. The upper body actually has some keyframes on it. It's not elegantly counter-keyed, but it's not just sort of stiffly flopping back and forth. And then the hands are also, keyed and doing some kind of very awkward floppy thing or something. So this is more like what I'd be hoping to see for the sort of work in progress animation. This should put you in a really nice spot to go through and to sort of refine things at a not completely horrifying pace as you go forward the next coming weeks. But yeah, so that's sort of like more or less like how I'd be looking at that as a grade. Any questions on that before I actually go into a few ways to sort of refine this a little bit more? Cool. All right. So a few things that I just like want to talk about is like an animation in general. Having looked at some of the, well, actually, I think if you submitted them by like yesterday at noon, I've graded them all. But like having looked at the walking animations, I did want to go over just sort of like one or two things again, just to make a point. So if we play through this, I've added just what I call like base animations, where like the pelvis is just sort of rotating back and forth, and the legs are moving forward. The feet are pretty much done. But you can see it's not like particularly dynamic. If you look at this from the side, like there's no or very little like up and down motion of the pelvis, and everything looks fairly stiff. So this is, again, kind of one of those things where sometimes it might be helpful. This is like that weird thing where I got up and was like, hey, let's take a walk around the room like crazy people. When I was trying to sort of like illustrate by that, where this is like a fairly unnatural motion of the hips. So what you can do to sort of enhance that and make it feel a little bit more physically plausible is, this is like, again, a really, really wonky, exaggerated version of this, but add some side-to-side motion of this, do a little bit of like weight shifting. You can see like as they pick up one foot, their pelvis sort of shifts to hold their center of balance over the other foot that's actually on the ground. And again, this is like super rough version of that, but it does feel even a little bit more lively than the previous version. You can also go in and add like, I did this where I kind of just like made the feet curve so they were walking more in almost like the character's trying to walk around like a tightrope or doing like a catwalk or something really silly. Certainly not like a normal walk cycle, but like it can be a little bit more interesting to do something like that. I find that's actually usually how I walk, is my feet sort of like overlap each other, so doing that can even make the character, again, feel a little bit more realistic depending on sort of what you're shooting for. And then I've gone through and added the sort of upper body counter key. So instead of having the upper body just, again, flop back and forth, just following the pelvis with no keyframes on it, you'll see the torso ball and the chest are sort of staying, more or less pointing upwards. It's a little bit jerky, but again, this is something that like should be done. And this is assuming that you don't have like one giant box for your robot center. I know like some of you have that as a design feature, in which case counter key the head, but you can pretty much just ignore the body. And I have also gone through and done the head as well, where it's bobby and ridiculous, but like it is sort of like pointing in one general spot for most of the walk. And then again, just doing the arms at some point, adding a little bit of flop to those. And in this case, so I exaggerated it like super, super aggressively for this particular walk, where you can see the hands are like really, really floppy and crazy, where it like almost feels like the hands are not even mounted in place. They're literally just flopping with the arm. But that is something that will make your walks, or just like everything in general, like having that secondary motion in the bottom of the arm makes things feel really, really fluid. And it took like an extra 2 minutes to set it up. Like it's kind of bizarrely straightforward. And I've also done, actually, if you look at sort of the toes as well, let me like scrub through. So this is just like my personal like thing that I think is like a really easy way to add a little bit of like extra polish and motion to your animations. So this, again, holds true for the arms, and if you have like toes, I do it a lot for toes. where if you watch as this character like puts his toe down, his heel touches down, and then his foot sort of flattens out, and right after that, his toes touch the ground. So like the toes are always sort of, if you watch this back leg here, the toes are always sort of like trailing down, and then as the character starts putting his foot down, it's almost like they're sort of, again, like flopping a little bit, where their motion is following after. You can see it really clearly here, where like the heel's rolling down and the toes are almost like sort of trailing behind it, and then they touch down after the foot. Good morning. So, cool. So that's one thing you can do to sort of, again, help your animations. Like if you have little areas like that, like tiny things like the toes, hair, arms, if you sort of like offset your keyframes a little bit of when things are happening, it'll make things feel a lot more natural. So if we look at the controls for this robot, where have I actually animated the arm? Wait for it. Okay. All right. So if we look at the controls for this arm, so here's the shoulder itself. So you can see here's this sort of like weird back and forth motion of this shoulder. I'm actually going to look at this arm because this one's like a little bit less janky. But if we sort of scrub through, so you can see like frame 40 is pretty much right where this arm gets to the front of the body before it starts moving backwards. So that's for the shoulder. And if we look at the elbow, you'll notice there's no frame on frame 40. What I've done is added a frame on 46. So frame 46 is when the elbow sort of hits its peak swing forward before it starts shifting backwards. So basically to sort of achieve that like floppy effect, you just stagger your frames a little bit. So it should be like usually fairly straightforward to do this, I think. But basically what that does is it gives the effect, if you've ever, I'm trying to think of like examples. If you've ever seen people like twirling a ribbon through the air, you'll like, where their hand moves, it grabs the ribbon and drags that part first, and it takes a while to perpetuate that new motion through the rest of the ribbon. So you can kind of think of that as an arm almost, where imagine like the sort of outer part of the arm is like the farthest part of the ribbon, and then your hand or like the base of the ribbon is connected at the shoulder. So when you move the shoulder, it's going to take a little while for that motion to sort of translate through the rest of the arm, if that makes any sense at all. So again, so frame 40 was where the shoulder sort of came forward, 46 is the elbow, and this wrist, apparently I've also done at frame 46 there. But you can kind of see, as I go back, I do the same thing, where this back swing you have on the arm, it looks like about 62 is where it sort of hits its most back rotation. I don't know how to say that better. And then it starts going forward. Again, this is for the shoulder, frame 62. On the elbow itself, that's happening on frame 65. So you have a little bit of that, like the arm almost like hyperextends as if it's being like jerked forward. So you can, again, staggering your keyframes will just sort of help make everything feel a little bit more natural if you're going for this sort of overly floppy effect, which I am personally very much a fan of. I think it's funny. But it can just in general, if you're trying to make a sort of realistic feeling walk cycle, doing stuff like that throughout your animation can make it feel a lot more realistic. Same thing for the head. As you're walking, again, the head was like pretty janky through this whole animation, but one thing you can do is, if you ever think of like cartoons where a character starts running and their legs move and then the rest of their body sort of like trails behind it, you could do a less exaggerated version of that where like if you move your pelvis, the head moves, you know, a few frames later. It like reacts to that pelvis moving. So that's just sort of one thing that you can do, again, to add a little bit more fluidity to your animations. Anyone have any questions on this so far? All right. The only other thing, I did want to point out just like a few sort of silly things with the rig, and then I'll show you how to actually go through with like the hypergraph and sort of refine some of these areas, make them a little bit less horrendous and jerky looking. So again, I did throw in these sort of control layers over here, or display layers. for different things. So it's really, really easy to go through and hide or show the controls on your character. You can set your skin to be non-selectable, which, like, for me, I think is really helpful, because if you're trying to, you know, grab a control or something like that, and you're accidentally grabbing your skin every 2 seconds, it's, like, very annoying. So those are just, again, really handy. The other thing that I did put on this robot, I think I made a quick video about this, or at least mentioned it. Hey guys, sorry, thank you. And again, this is completely optional, but if you have finger controls, you can add these little sort of automated controls, so you don't need to actually go in and like grab this mess of controls in your hand. You can just sort of be like, all right, I'm just gonna give some like generic bend to the fingers here. So that's just, again, a quick handy thing you can do. It takes like 2 minutes to set up. It just makes your animations feel a little bit, or just like a little bit easier to sort of work with in general. Feel free to laugh at this random thumb control that is floating off in the middle of nowhere. But yeah, so that's just, again, like two quick things I just wanted to point out about how the rig is set up. The other thing, if you do make display layers, make them in your rig file. They will transfer over into any file you reference it in, so you don't need to sort of reset up anything, which is, again, just sort of handy. It'll also make your life a little bit easier if you're working with a partner, because you can sort of like label stuff and have it, just have it like really nicely set up so you guys aren't like fighting with each other's files. Cool. So, a few different things you can do to sort of refine this animation, or look at it a little bit more closely. And most of this is just going to be me going through in the Graph Editor. So if you go into Windows, Animation Editors, and Graph Editor, it'll pull up this giant beastly little thing. And the Graph Editor, I had no idea how to use it for the longest time, and then I figured out how to use it, and I was like, wow, this actually saves me a lot of time. So I do highly recommend it. I recognize it maybe takes like a little while to sort of like get into it and figure out what exactly is happening, but it is extremely helpful for going through and refining animations with fewer keyframes. So it does get a little bit weird when you're using display layers. But basically, this is like more or less the graph editor if you have something selected. It's just going to go through and show you a visual representation for any attributes that have keyframes on it on whatever you have selected, in this case my root controller. And it shows you that across basically whatever frames you have keyed. So in this case, you can see it's going from like frame 0 to frame, I don't know, 85 or like 80-ish, wherever I've ended this animation. So your frame range is basically on the x-axis of this, and the actual values input for your translate, rotate, etc. are input on the y. And again, it's a little bit like weird to, I guess, wrap your head around how this actually works at first. So you can actually click on specific values. So like if you only want to look at translate x, you can just click on that. It'll bring that up as the only thing visible. This is really, really helpful because, like, honestly, this is a nightmare. It does generally go through and sort of color code things. So like usually anything with the x-axis is red, y is going to be green, and blue is z. But effectively what this is doing is just saying, hey, here is how your character is moving, or like this object is moving over a period of time. So if we're looking at translate y, that's basically just the up and down movement of your character. You can see that it starts off a little bit at frame 1. I'm actually gonna, cool. So it starts out negative, and you can see how it kind of like, it goes up, and then it comes down, and then it comes up and down and up and down. So that's like more or less how to sort of read the graph editor. I feel like translate y is like usually a fairly straightforward thing to look at. Does anybody have any questions about the graph editor like going forward? I know I've done like demos on it for setting up turntables and stuff like that, but like, does it kind of make sense like how you look at this and how you want to read it? Sweet. All right. So usually the first thing that I do whenever I go into my graph editor and I want to start refining an animation And it sounds really weird as I go in and I just start deleting keyframes. So firstly, I do just want to sort of make you guys aware, you can modify, if you change a value in your graph editor, so all these little yellow diamonds are keyframes, where keyframes are. If you grab this and move it up and down, you can, that'll physically change your animation. You can also change the position of the keyframe itself. So like if I move this to frame 30 something, it should, shift that keyframe over and sort of modifies that way. So changing this will affect your animation. And the first thing, again, that I usually do, and this is just to go through and sort of get rid of jitter in the animation, is I'll look for keyframes that don't seem to be doing a whole heck of a lot, like this guy here. This is making super, super negligible effect on my animation. I'm just going to go ahead and scrub over to that keyframe. I'm curious what it's doing. I'm literally just going to delete that entire keyframe for translate Y. And I'll do this over here at the beginning as well. Okay, that one maybe was kind of necessary. Actually, yeah, I'll delete it. What the heck? So I'll delete that one, and in place of that, I'll just sort of grab this handle up. So this is basically just like a Bezier curve. It modifies the same way, more or less, that you would do in Illustrator, and sort of modify things that way. And I usually go through and I do that for pretty much everything. So you can also go in and sort of look at maybe this curve is a little bit aggressive. But I've found actually that doing this, I didn't used to do this for a really long time. And after I started going through, and again, just sort of systematically deleting keyframes that were like this thing, which is pretty much just on the line, not really doing all that much, it smoothed out the animation a lot with extremely minimal work. And it actually allowed, I think generally the fewer keyframes you have to modify, the easier it is to make smooth animation. And going through and literally just deleting some of those keyframes actually helped a lot with just sort of super easy smoothing of animation with almost no effort on your part. And from there, usually you can just sort of tweak the little handles of the Bezier curve to modify the curve itself, if that makes sense. So a lot of times I'll actually go through and sort of do that for all of the animations. Sometimes usually it doesn't hurt anything. Every once in a while you will sort of want those sharp modifications in there. But that's one of the first things that I'll usually start doing, again, just to go in and really quickly start modifying stuff. It's the first thing I do. I just, again, find it a little bit easier to work with fewer keyframes. It's think of modeling, where it's usually advised start with or use the sort of minimal number of polygons that you can. Because if you need to make changes, it's going to be way easier to shift 4 or 5 edge loops around than it is to do 40. Same principle applies to the graph editor. So you can go through and kind of modify that. I'm sure if we look at the arms, I can find something horrendous here. Okay. And this one actually, it'll show you, so here, these little groups are actually the animation layers that I have set up. So we have sort of whatever I've done on the base animation here. If you expand that, you can see all the keyframes for that. This is pretty much me just making the arms not T-pose. And then you can see down in this arms layer, I have most of the actual animation in there. Presumably, I've done most of the animation on rotation. So again, just go through, and I'm just going to sort of delete, especially for something, I find for stuff like arms, you really don't need that much. It is pretty much just it swings back and it swings forward and then back and forward and back and forward. And you'll notice that not all of these curves are happening, or they don't all go to the same value each time. It's a lot of up and down and sort of organic motion. And doing that, I mean, you have to hand animate anything anyway. Doing that actually makes things look a little bit more natural, I think, because, granted, these are robot characters, but they're supposed to more or less be moving like humans. And as humans walk, there's natural variation in their step based on how you're moving. If you're hopping over a crack or something like that, your arm's going to behave differently, just in general. So having this sort of irregularity is actually another thing I think that helps a lot to make things look significantly more natural. Apparently Rotate Z is just rife with just random spare keyframes. So again, I'm going to just sort of delete all of these, and you can see that's barely changing the curve at all. So if we look at this arm again, just for the shoulder, this might not even make a huge amount of difference, but it is just a little bit easier to work with. And you can see that still makes a pretty dang smooth animation, mostly just looking at the sort of upper shoulder area again. So that's, once you sort of start refining animations, again, I do highly recommend the graph editor. It's ginormous on my screen right now. It is very, very helpful. And if nothing else, it can kind of, if you're looking for something in particular, like maybe you have, let me go in and just like add a really bad keyframe in here for a second. Just like something really crazy. Yes. If you ever have like a weird glitch or like a pop in your animation, sometimes you can go through and like visually find that with your graph editor. So in this case, I know exactly where I put that. It's like one sort of keyframe right on frame 35. And you can see it's making this like really strange, aggressive motion over those frames. So if you're ever, again, sort of like wondering where is that coming from, you can kind of see it in your graph editor. So if you look at this, like, I mean, for one, you can visually see that there's two keyframes like very, very close to each other. And there's an extreme value difference, particularly in the rotate X value, or like this little red line. And you'll also notice the same thing with this translate Y value. So you'll notice, like, again, this is like pretty smooth, and then all of a sudden, within one frame, we have this super crazy extreme drop-off. This can be a really, really good way, again, to just like find weird glitches in your animation. This is probably the second thing that I most use my graph editor for, is just like, I've done something dumb. What have I done? Where is the frame? So in this case, you could go through and maybe sometimes I accidentally like move a keyframe somewhere I don't want. So if you wanted to, and like this was a good frame, but from somewhere else, you could, move it, just like shift it over back into place. Or you could go through and just be like, that was a horrible idea. Let me just get rid of this keyframe, or like get rid of, whatever the offending values are. And sort of work that way. So again, it can be pretty handy for sort of troubleshooting your animation as well as refining it. That's honestly pretty much the graph editor. I think there's like one more thing that I kind of want to show you if it shows up. It kind of sort of shows up. So I set up my rig a little bit weird, and I just sort of didn't fix this because I was being lazy, but it makes an interesting point for showing sort of animation. So this arm, you'll notice that if I click on the little gimbal, it rotates really nicely just directly along the axis of this little controller I've added, whereas this one has this sort of weird 45-degree offset. It's because it's got put there when I parented under the shoulder because of the shoulder offset, and like I said, I just sort of never fixed it. But I would actually recommend fixing it if you have that option. It'll save you a little bit of trouble when you're doing your animation, and just make your life easier down the road. I just didn't really plan on animating this, so I just kind of left it there. But in terms of actually doing your animation, so if you if you go into your tool settings for your rotate or any of your other tool settings and set your axis orientation to object, it should, again, sort of orient itself directly with the control that you have set up. Other weird sort of tidbit or hotkey, if your little gimbal is ever like a weird size you don't like maybe it's really tiny or something like that and you want it larger, or vice versa, just the plus or minus keys will shrink or enlarge that gimbal. So you can just do, again, like this I think is confusing with the control, so I'm just gonna make it ginormous, why not? But that also holds for the elbow. So you can see, again, that pretty much like lines up directly with that little control we've made. If this is set to world rotation, as you rotate this, it is basically two things are happening. One, it's not paying any attention to how this joint is supposed to work, and it's ripping my arm apart, which obviously is not super ideal. The other thing it's doing, if you watch the actual rotation values of the control itself, it's changing all of them at once. It's not inherently bad for that to happen. It does just make it a little bit harder, like if you're going through your graph editor later, it makes it a little bit harder to figure out what exactly is happening. Compare that to doing object mode. And, oh yeah, I've animated this. I've animated this in world mode too much. Let me do a bad thing, just really quickly delete all of the animations on that part of the arm. Haha, that should fix my issue. Cool. All right. Pretty much, if you ever animate in world mode, it'll kind of like mess up using object mode in the future. But for the most part, if you are using object-centered rotation, you'll notice that again, I can pretty much only move the rotate Y of this, and it's going to rotate it in the correct direction for the arm, basically, and it's only changing that rotate Y. And then if I start, doing other things with the other axes, it gets like a little bit weird. So I would highly, highly, highly recommend making sure that if you are in object mode or object orientation for your rotation, that it is sort of following the correct direction for the handles as you set them up to function with your rig. Again, in this case, it's not really a possibility because of how I have these handles set up. So it just makes it a little bit harder to animate. I either, if I move one axis, then I have to like sort of shove this one back into place or the arm breaks, or I have to just sort of suck it up and animate in world mode, which gives you a lot of the same issues, honestly. So it's not an ideal way to sort of work. You can see it makes things a lot harder to do basically the same kind of animation. And then if you ever, do something like rotate your root really aggressively, it makes it that much harder to animate in the future, because then your world mode really breaks down, whereas like it was just walking forward on the Z-axis, and now I have to like, again, to sort of jam it. I have to do like 5 motions or like 5 keyframes to get this back into place, and it's still kind of broken, and it's just like very, very annoying to actually work with. So again, it's not technically broken. It's not going to cause any functional issues with your rig. It does just make it a lot harder to animate. Which is why I was sort of recommending to try to avoid that kind of thing if I saw that pop up in anyone's rigs. Anyone have any questions about that or any other stuff I've gone over so far? Okay. That, I think, was pretty much my weird sort of bit on animating and using the, what the heck is this thing called? I always forget. Hypergraph? Graph editor, dang it. So that was pretty much, again, my weird sort of bit with that. Any questions on that before we go forward? I'll probably touch on maybe 1 or 2 more things if I see like common errors throughout animations. But that's just sort of my weird like brief intro for now. Cool. All right. Really quickly before we nip into the sort of weird tree demo that I promised last week, I did want to go over just like really quickly the sort of play blast settings that ideally you should be using whenever you're doing play blasts. So first of all, please go and again turn off all of your controls. If you have like weird skeletons and stuff like that showing, turn that off. Make sure it's just the geometry in your scene. And then usually I'll just there's like 3 ways to get to this menu. I just usually right click on the time slider and then go into the settings for Play Blast. And you do, so there's like 2 or 3 things that you want to select. You can export an image sequence if you want, which I've never found a reason to do that. But usually, if I want it to look nice, I'm going to go ahead and set the quality all the way to 100. And then probably the most important thing, I think, is setting your scale to 1 instead of 0.5. 0.5 is basically going to shrink things down by 50%. So I got like a lot of renders that were like really, really, really tiny and like really grainy and like pretty hard to look at just because they were so grainy. So do make sure that you're setting your scale up to the full size. And then for display size, if you care It's less important for just like random tests, but if you're doing final play blast to test your camera angle, stuff like that, you would want to set display size to be from render settings. And this should go through if you've set this to be full HD in your render settings. It's going to also make your play blast full HD. It also just sort of guarantees things are in the, proper size, all that good stuff. So make sure, again, that you are using display size from render settings. It'll at least get you the correct aspect ratio for your play blast. Set your scale to 1 and set quality to 100. At that point, you should be good, usually, to go ahead and just hit play blast. It'll run through and do the things. I have no idea where this is going to be deposited. Ooh, wow, that's put in a really random spot. Okay, cool. So this should be your play blast. And then most times, again, so I'm asking going forward for MP4s or MOVs. My computer gets a little bit hissy with AVI files. But also play blasts are horrendously inefficient in terms of size. So I got like a lot of 4-second, 4-second animation play blasts that were like 400 megabytes. So please, again, do go through and compress those. You can convert them to MP4 or MOVs at the same time. But do, again, try to sort of minimize the file size if you can. That should be the basic play blast settings. If you're looking to make it look a little bit nicer, there's 2 things that you can click, and this is just sort of also makes your viewport a little bit nicer. So up here in all of these like little icons like right above the viewport, you'll notice that there's a button for multi-sample anti-aliasing. It's sort of like a blue partial circle with like a pixely other side on the right. If you click that, it's going to go through and, again, pretty much just do a little bit of anti-aliasing, smoothing around the sort of corners of things. It's particularly noticeable, I find, on controls, where like if you have maybe scrolled out a little bit far and your controls are like a little bit pixely around the edges, turn on anti-aliasing. It'll make them much smoother and like kind of easier to look at. So that'll hold true in your play blast as well as working in the outliner, which I think is nice, or in your viewport. And then the other thing you can turn on is the screen space ambient occlusion, which is like 2 buttons to the right, 2 buttons to the left of the anti-aliasing. And what that does is basically just adds fake shadows to your stuff. So this is particularly handy. You'll notice it's a little bit more obvious here. A lot of times it can sort of, if you're having issues like differentiating textures from like the ground plane or something like that, having that fake little shadow just popped in there makes it a little bit easier to tell what's going on and makes it a little bit nicer to sort of look at. Ooh, interesting. I forgot you can do that. If you ever, for some reason, want to modify these settings, you can go into Renderer, just, again, the little icon right above the viewport, and open the settings for whatever viewport that you're using. You can see then you can modify the settings for the screen space ambient occlusion. You can make it super crazy dark if you want. Play with the radius. So you can like mess with the settings to get sort of whatever you want. Ooh. That's actually a very interesting effect. But you can kind of mess with things and, again, just sort of do whatever is easier for you guys to look at. Play with a bunch of other settings. Just general viewport settings are sort of there if you ever need to play with them for whatever reason. That being said, that is pretty much my weird bit on this silly animation that I've done. Any questions on that before we go over to wonky trees? Cool. Kind of attached to this weird setting. All right. So wonky trees. Anybody ever used paint effects before for trees and plants and such? Yeah.
Also, I like said walking trees.
Walking trees. That should be a thing that I do at some point. Extra credit assignment. Everybody make walking trees. Not actually a thing, but if you do, it'll be funny. So paint effects is really, really handy. If you go into Windows, where is it? General Editors, Content Browser. So again, Windows, General Editors, Content Browser. Pull that up. The lag is real. See, normally there's stuff displayed there. All right. Great. So there's a bunch of different things that usually, like, that you can sort of pull up in here. There's random preset shaders. There's random preset models. I'm curious about this big fish model. So like this, you can just drag it into your scene, and it gives you pretty much a big fish, as promised. So there's a bunch of sort of weird sample stuff here that you can start with. In this case, honestly, this is really fun to go through and just like see what random stuff you can generate. Highly recommend just like playing with this randomly. I might restart this really quick. This is being really slow. Oh God. I don't know what's worse. These computers get really laggy and my home computer just crashes. Neither are preferable. Def. All right. Well, if any of you happen to have functional paint effects open on your computers, there should be a tab under the content browser for paint effects. And if you open that, there should be a bunch of sort of random things in there, just like folders upon folders of random things that you can generate. There's one for trees, and in this case, that's what we're going to use. So now we have Maya. So again, Windows General Editor's content browser. There is this, again, tab for paint effects with a bunch of stuff just everywhere. There's like, you can literally just generate random feathers. So you just click on one and then pretty much just draw in your viewport, and you can see it's just generated a bunch of like little feathers for you. And they're textured, and it's like really like very strange, sort of interesting way to do things. You can generate different ropes and just like doodle some rope for yourself. Not the prettiest rope, but you know, gets the job done. So again, these are like absurdly fun to play with. There's one that generates like crystals, which is kind of fun. I think there's different like weird sort of toon shaders. In this case, I'm just going to look at the sort of trees. Never played with underwater before. So I'm just going to grab this sort of cherry tree, sure, what the heck. And what I'm going to do is, again, just sort of click in my viewport and drag, and it is just automatically generating me some random cherry trees. It's made a delightful clump of them, and buttons, and it's lagging again. All right. So that's the basics of paint effects, is honestly just like click a thing and make a scribble in your viewport, and it'll populate things along that scribble. So this is really, really handy for base trees. You will notice the downside of this is that sometimes it makes really high poly stuff. And that's kind of not ideal sometimes. There's a few things that you can do to edit these after they're created. So if you go into, just like click on your little paint effects tree grove that you've created, go into the cherry tree 1 node, or like whatever node is like thing you've generated 1. You don't want the shape node or the stroke node. So you should be able to go down, there's the settings for tubes, and then some more sort of tabs under that for like creation, growth. So this one is basically, I kind of recommend just like playing with these settings to sort of tweak this to whatever you want. But again, you don't want the shape or the stroke node, just go under like the cherry tree node, tubes, and then you can sort of like tweak things from there. But it allows you to add in more cherry trees, fewer cherry trees. Do be aware if you put these sliders up really high with this many polys, sometimes Maya does get a little bit hissy. Yes, good. I've broken it again, hooray. Yes, that's perhaps too many cherry trees. Great. What if you do like 05? Okay, we have 1 tree, that's better. And you can do a bunch of different stuff with this. You can play with the width. One thing that's also really handy is being able to play with the quote-unquote growth of the tree. So if you decide, hey, I don't want leaves, you can just turn off the leaves. Same thing with this is apparently what it looks like without branches. Awkward hair follicle. And then you can go through, and they have different settings for all of these. So you can go through and like really sort of like tweak and refine these. You can add pretty much generate more trees. This might be good for doing like a little pudgy bush or something like that. You can also go through and like make basically fewer branches. There should be somewhere in here, there's some settings for like thickness of these. I just don't remember where that is. And then again, if you have, you know, stuff like if you've actually turned on leaves, oh, that's glorious. There should be some different settings for that. So you can make like clusters of leaves. There you go. Just do some like really strange effects. This is actually apparently not a bad way to just like generate a deck of cards. But there's also, again, other settings for that and just like different things. You can mess with sort of, usually I do honestly just sort of go through these settings and like randomly play with things and see what happens. You can add more leaf segments if you want, basically just more polys. And you can see that that sort of changes the shape and makes them weird and droopy and goobly. Apparently you can turn them also into tubes or worms if you need that. But there's a lot of just sort of like weird different things you can play with these where like, honestly it is easier to sort of go through and like mess with them individually. But that's the basics of how to actually generate a tree. I might generate a slightly different one because this is actually gonna be really, really gross to demo on. So I'm just gonna go ahead and generate a dead birch tree, which for some reason is like super tiny. But all the same settings exist for this. So again, if we go under this sort of tubes thing, if we wanted to, we could add leaves to these. And now we just have like basically a thicker version of the cherry tree. They also give you the option for flowers, which I've found to always be enormous and really questionable. I'm just gonna leave this as sort of a dead birch tree for now. So that's basically generating things with paint effects. Some of these things also have animations, like the cherry tree. You can see that just like has random animations on it. So if you were to sort of let your play blast glow, that would just, you know, be nice wind or something in the back of your scene. If you go crazy modifying this, those animations will break down and cease to exist. But it is something to be aware of. Sometimes there's also plants. So there's a plants tab in Paint Effects as well. So they have like brambles and other weird stuff that you can generate. You can generate carrots, which I find funny. But there should be one, I can never remember where this is, but like a lot of these have animations on them as well. Carrots. Yeah. Lettuce. This looks nothing like lettuce. What? Okay. Sometimes Paint Effects is questionable. But anyway, that's basically Paint Effects. Again, a lot of this, there's a tab for like grasses or something somewhere. If you find that, they have a lot of really nice ones with animation on them. It is honestly just sort of fun to play around with sometimes. But yeah, so making these actually usable. So right now, these will actually render. I'm just gonna go ahead and throw a crappy physical sky in my scene and do a render. Really? What are you doing? Okay. This is, what have I done? Okay. So you will notice that a lot of times Paint Effects does not automatically render with Arnold or Redshift. A lot of times you will need to apply sort of alternate rendering techniques to this. Interestingly, if you go in and you render this with like Maya software, which normally is a thing I very much do not recommend doing, but that will actually render stuff, and usually it actually, these textures that it comes with are designed to render with Maya software. And like now the lettuce actually kind of resembles lettuce instead of whatever that insanely shameful thing it was before, sort of. It kind of looks lettucey, kind of, sort of. But again, so be aware of that if you are trying to render this with Arnold, you probably will need to retexture these. And you should be able to, like if I just go through and assign a new material to this, I'm just going to make it a Lambert because I'm being lazy, and just make it blue, because blue lettuce. Okay, oh yeah, sorry, you have to convert it to polys first. Sorry. Two things you need to do to this before you can render it in something like Arnold. I normally honestly don't render these, so I forgot. First of all, these are not actual polygons as it stands right now. So the only polygons in my scene is literally this plane that I've created. These are all just sort of paint effects, which are like their own weird thing. So we need to convert these to polygons before we sort of mess with them or like modify them further. So what I'm going to do, I'll just grab the sort of dead birch trees I've made and go modify, convert, and there should be an option for paint effects to polygons. Cool, which apparently I've clicked on. So there's like a few things you can do. You can try to preserve the color if you do vertex color mode with, just click this color. You can turn on quad output if you're concerned about having it output tries. Sometimes it works better than others. The other option, hide strokes, is basically going to hide, it's just going to, it won't delete it, it'll just like hide it in your outliner, the original strokes and polypaint trees that were there. So you can turn that on if you want. And then the other thing to be aware of is this poly limit. So this is saying, hey, you know, do I want to cap this at some point so my Maya scene doesn't blow up? And it just flashed up a tooltip saying if you enter 0, it will just input however many polygons it needs to fully recreate this polypaint tree bush. So we should be able, I'm just going to leave this poly limit and just go ahead and hit apply once I actually select this dead birch tree. Hit apply. Okay. And let me open my outliner. So you can see we have this sort of dead birch tree mesh group. And once I've selected that, if you happen to be looking at the poly count, you'll notice that the poly count for the scene has gone up. And pretty much almost all of that is, again, this little tree mesh that has been generated. Whereas previously it was only the, 121 verts from the ground plane. So that's, again, sort of converting polypaint to geometry if you need to modify it. It's just the Modify tab, modify, convert, paint effects to polys. It's the same thing you'd use if you were doing anything in NURBS and you wanted to like convert that to polys, etc. There's also an option in here for, if any of you are ever instancing anything with like a duplicate special, there's an option in Modify Convert to also do it's like just instance to object. So just click that. It'll get rid of any instancing information you have if you're, sometimes it causes issues with stuff. But once you're happy with it, you can convert that to an object, modify it separately, etc. For some reason, I didn't know about that recently, and it was very, very handy. So once these are polys, then you should actually be good to go ahead and just like assign them a new material. We can see now that these are blue. And if we try to render this with Arnold, it should actually show up because it is polygons and has, textures that Arnold would actually recognize. So this, if you are using background trees in your scene for like fairly far away, you could totally leave your tree like this. It's not super smooth. It's just sort of like it's a pretty low poly tree. So if you're pushing in like really crazy close to this, I wouldn't necessarily recommend, zooming in this close. I would maybe do a little bit more work of like 1 or 2 nice trees for like hardcore close-ups like this. But for far away distance stuff, like this is totally fine. The one thing I do want to point out about these trees, if we do a mesh separate on these, this is where polypaint gets a little bit weird. Like all of these, it's just like different random clipping pieces of tree, just sort of without rhyme or reason. Wait, what am I doing? Sorry. Center the pivot on these. So this is just a bunch of like individual chunks of basically broken geometry just sort of attached to each other. So it's not ideal, like if you sort of go to smooth this, sometimes this one actually behaves pretty well, but you can see it is making some really kind of gross aggressive seams, particularly like right here, this little branch. And you can, again, just like see some different texturing seams. It'll make texturing a little bit harder. So there's a few ways you can sort of combine these together. Let me actually go through really quick and just file, export the selection as tree obj. Great. So the easiest thing to do, if you have, you know, two pieces that pretty much just butt up to each other like this, you should be able to just do a mesh combine and then a mesh merge, and it's going to go ahead and just attach all of those seams together automatically. That kind of breaks down for stuff like this down here, where you have more things just sort of like clipping through each other. So combining polypaint trees into one can get like a little bit janky. There's a really not bad way to do it in ZBrush though, which is kind of helpful. So again, this is like if you were, you know, if you needed like a really high detail branch or something, it might be nice to go in and like actually assemble the branch pseudo correctly so it doesn't look like a polypaint tree branch. So if you are trying to do that and you are trying to do it with ZBrush, this is how I recommend doing it. Export your whole polypaint tree like I just did, and go ahead and import that tree from, where did I put my tree? Where did I put my tree? Documents, my projects, default, seams. Hey, my stuff from back from last quarter. All right, so grab the tree, click and drag to dump that in your ZBrush scene, and don't forget to hit this edit button up here, otherwise it will just draw trees forever. So again, hit edit. If you ever do end up in this situation, you'll notice like as I rotate around, you only have one tree that's moving. Go into your layer menu up here and just go ahead and hit clear. It should get rid of all of the other miscellany trees just floating aimlessly in your scene. So we have our tree. There is what I'm going to sort of call a pseudo magic button for making broken meshes unbroken in ZBrush. So you'll notice if you look down here, I'm going to Shift F to turn on my wireframe. There's still clipping geometry here, and you'll notice like the ends of these trees are all just sort of like open and none of them are capped or anything like that. There is actually options to fix that as you're generating the polypaint, but easy way to sort of fix this is go into, on your right, this geometry tab here. And I mentioned both of these functions, I think, last week. The Dynamesh and the Z Remesher. So these are really, really handy for sort of redoing topology on objects. Dynamesh, in this case, is what we want to use to basically fix this tree. What it does is it goes through, I'm just going to hit Dynamesh and just see sort of what it does. If you're looking at the wireframe, you'll notice that it's gone through and sort of tried to basically attach anything together. It's going to try to make your mesh what is called manifold. So basically free of errors, but it's also going through and we hit Dynamesh. You can see it's like capped off all the ends, so it's going to close open areas, basically merge any weird areas that we're clipping into one and just sort of make like a nice solid shell around your piece. So it's really, really handy for stuff like this where you're like, I just have a bunch of random meshes that are clipping each other. Let me just Dynamesh it. It should sort of attach them all together. Z Remesher is slightly different. It still tries to apply, nicer quads and better edge flow, but it doesn't do anything. You can see there's like still some wonky geometry clipping each other and like still looks pretty weird. So if you're working with something like this, you want to hit it with a Dynamesh first. And just go ahead and you can see it kind of combines everything into one, again, nice-ish tree. The weird thing about Dynamesh is sometimes it'll sort of like, for really thin areas, it'll sort of like destroy parts of your tree, which is not ideal. If that becomes an issue and you need that detail in there, you can try increasing the resolution of this. It is going to make your poly count significantly higher, but you'll notice like this is Dynameshed. It has extremely dense topology now, but we also do have those little tips of the trees being preserved. So that's how to set up a Dynamesh. And basically just sort of like automatically fix the tree. Again, it's gone through, it's capped all of the ends of this and pretty much made it like a functional non-broken mesh. Anybody have any questions on that? Okay. Other thing about Dynamesh, which you probably noticed, is like this tree is like really, really blocky looking. So this is usually the point where I would go through and like even smoothing it. I'm just holding shift again to access my smooth brush and sort of scribbling on it. Is not doing a whole lot to fix that. So this is the point usually where I'd come in maybe with like a Z remesher and go ahead and just hit Z remesh on that. Because there's so many polygons, it's going to take a little bit to calculate this, although I wasn't banking on this long. But what this should do is give you hopefully not terrible edge flow. It's going to make your life a little bit easier to UV later. It's also just going to have basically less resolution, so that if you did want to come back and round that trunk out, now you should be able to go in and just sort of hit it with that smooth brush. There's enough geometry where it's holding the volume of this, but it no longer looks like an absurdly low poly tree. Then you can also go through and sort of like smooth out, and you can do this as neatly as you want, which I'm not being particularly neat, but you can go through and sort of like smooth out the rest of the branches. So you have one big, nice sort of connected tree mesh, like this. Excuse me. The other nice thing that you can do, so like, this is still really, really high poly. Like, we do not need, unless you're getting like really close to this tree, you do not need a 50,000 polygon tree in your scene. That's madness. You should be able to go up, still under the geometry tab, and just hit this. So remember last week when we were actually sculpting on stuff, we did the divide tab, and that's going to add in more, it's going to subdivide your model, add in more geometry, so we can see we now are at 62,000 polys. There is a button if you have decent edge flow with quads in it, which again, Z remesher will give you, where you should be able to do this reconstruct subdivision button. And if you click this, you gonna flash me that error? What? Hang on. No. Okay. Sometimes it works, other times it doesn't work as well. But sometimes what it'll let you do is basically go through and like unsubdivide your model, so you have still like the nice quads, but just fewer edge flow things to worry about. In this case, if that's not working, you could try setting your resolution of your target poly count for your Z remesher significantly lower, and run another Z remesh. And you can see now we have a slightly lower poly tree that is only 1,000 polygons. But it is, again, nice and sort of connected together. This is something, if you put this into Maya and you smoothed it, it would look nice. But it also sort of holds up as its own low-ish poly asset if you wanted to have this as sort of like foreground tree kind of thing. So that's like basic sort of tree stuff. At this point, what I would usually do is go in, you can UV in ZBrush. Have no idea how to do it, honestly. I just do it in Maya. So I would usually go through and just sort of export this tree as an OBJ, throw that back into Maya, and then UV it. And then if you wanted to add any kind of weird textures or something like that, you could go ahead and do that in Maya. I'm sorry, you can put it back into ZBrush after it's UV'd, make your texture maps, and then have nice textures. And I will show you, I mentioned last week you could import alphas. I do actually want to show you that, just like as a really quick demo. So here we have our new tree. New tree here compared to original tree. And you can see that like functionally they actually look fairly similar, just at first glance. Again, this one's a little bit lower poly. This one would be better for sort of texturing or smoothing. Once you smooth it, I think the difference between the two is fairly apparent, where like, again, this doesn't super smooth very nicely. But again, it just kind of depends on what you need. The other thing that's nice about ZBrush is if you wanted to, you could go in and like sort of physically alter the shape of the tree. You could perhaps, punch a knot or something like that into it and add a little bit more detail that way. So really quick, and actually, anybody have any questions about any of that? Cool. All right. If you guys are ever looking for random ZBrush alphas, usually you can type in the texture that you're looking for. In this case, I'll do tree bark. That seems kind of logical. You can find them on textures.com. You need an account for that to download them. So I found this crappy one from Pinterest, but like this is pretty much what you're looking for. So I'm just going to go ahead and save this image as bark. Hooray. And I'll do another one just to sort of like show you, if I can find it, like the variation of like what you'd be looking for. So here's another example of like a random cool ornament you could stamp onto something. Go ahead and save that. Scroll. And if you're in ZBrush and you actually want to use these, this is again sort of assuming that you've either want the high poly sculpt or you have already UV'd this object. You would want to go in, still in your geometry tab, just go ahead and add some more subdivisions to this so that there are many more polygons to work with. And this is how you generally import your brushes. You normally go into the alpha. So they have, again, all these like weird preset ones that you can use. They have these like weird little stars. If you want to import your own, let's go down. There's this little import button. It's usually fairly straightforward, like literally just find the thing you want to stamp on. I'll grab my bark, and you can see it's gone through and just imported that automatically. I can select it later if I want to. And then I should be good to just stamp this bark onto my tree. So this is like a super, super easy way to just get like a lot of, I could probably actually subdivide this a little lower. But a really, really easy way to make sort of nice textures on your stuff very, very easily with these sort of predefined internet brushes. You can always swap out different brushes. Again, if you want your scroll, you can grab that and stamp that on, and it'll give you this really cool sort of weird flowery pattern motif thing. At that point, again, you could either export the high poly sculpt if you needed that for 3D printing or something like that. For trees, I don't recommend that. Texturing would be better for this. But yeah, that's my weird sort of secondary bit on ZBrush and Goofy Trees. And obviously this would also work for like a bunch of other stuff in general. I've taken to sort of using ZBrush a lot for sort of sculpting characters and then going back and like retopologizing it later. So it is really helpful sort of just to shape things, or again, Z-remesher is really, really handy if you have a lot of objects and you just need to like really quickly combine them together, and perhaps Booleans are for some reason not working. And again, I generally don't recommend Booleans, but if you're not smoothing your model, you can get away with them. So that's a quick bit on ZBrush trees. Anybody have any questions about that? Okay. I did want to go over really, really quick how to sort of, so like you have this goofy tree that you've set up. Maybe you actually want to populate a scene with trees. So I want to show you a sort of quick and easy way to do that using Mash. Mash is delightful for so many things. First, let me just really quickly figure out where the heck I put my tree. Hey, my tree. Sure, I'll use this one. So I'll throw my tree back in here. What? Questionable. All right. Cool. All right, so we have our janky tree. I'm just going to assign this really quickly a new material so you can actually see it on the background. Alternately, I'll make the tree green because that seems like a great plan. The other thing I'm going to do to this is just go through and move the object back kind of close to the origin-ish. Every once in a while, Mash gets a little bit hissy if your object is like super far away from the origin. So that's just sort of me preemptively, hopefully, preventing issues. Basically, what Mash does is it's a way to more or less procedurally model or like populate scenes. It has a bizarre amount of uses. Anything from populating a scene with trees to make a landscape, to populating scales on a snake, which is a thing that I just did the other day. In 20 minutes, I added over 1,000 scales to a snake instead of having to lay them all in by hand. It was amazing. But setting up MASH should be pretty straightforward. I will disclaimer this. I've had 1 or 2 people say that like once they started scene with MASH in it, it broke very badly, in which case I would recommend sort of set up your MASH in something separate, so if it for some reason breaks, you don't have to worry about it if you need to start over and you're not losing any other data. I've never personally had that issue, but I had like 2 people say that that was an issue for them, so I'm just like, disclaimer, sometimes MASH gets weird. But if you're in this MASH tab, just go ahead, select whatever object you want to sort of duplicate, and click on this button on the very left, this Create MASH Network button. By default, what it's going to do, I don't know why this is the default, it just makes a line of 10 of your objects. It also has, so here is our original tree, it's still just kicking around in the scene. By default, MASH just hides it. So, and then I have my ground plane here. So, obviously this looks really weird, unless maybe you're making an orchard. So usually what you want to do is like modify the way that this looks or behaves. So if you open up right next to the sort of Create MASH Network button, there's this MASH editor. I like to think of this as the outliner for MASH. It just shows you all of the stuff that you have sort of set up and allows you to really easily like turn it on and off. So in this case, every time you make a MASH network, by default, it's going to make one of these little MASH distribute nodes. This is basically saying, hey, how is this populating or like duplicating your object? So if you look in here, you have a different, number of points. You can play with how they're spaced, but right now there's like different stuff. Oh God. Cool. Actually, I look at this and I laugh, but I'm like, maybe you need an orchard on a very tiny sphere planet. I don't know. No, I have no idea why you'd want that in particular, but there's like different sort of default things to set it up for. Maybe you do actually need an orchard. Usually the one that I end up using is the mesh option, and that will allow you, it's like, please connect a mesh. It lets you populate these trees along a mesh. So in this case, I'm going to turn the ground plane back on, and I'm just going to, with this MASH distribute selected, middle mouse button, click on my p-plane 1, and drag it into input mesh. And at that point, it should populate these extremely tiny trees along my ground plane. And at this point, adding, you see, if you add more little trees, it does a better job of sort of populating that. There's also different settings within the mesh distribution you can choose. So scatter will just sort of like randomly put trees all over your mesh. I'm actually going to turn on anti-aliasing and screen space name and occlusion. Hopefully makes things a little nicer to look at. So scatter, you can do vertex, which is going to line everything up perfectly, pretty much along, on each vertice on this mesh, there is a tree. So if you know very specifically where you want trees, you can go through and like just arrange, basically put a vertex like wherever you want a tree. They also have, options for random vertices if you were looking for like more sort of random grid pattern. There's a bunch of different options you can choose for these. And it's kind of cool because if you ever needed to sort of, I'm almost thinking of like Pac-Man pellets. Like you could almost populate sort of by keyframing this number of points, have these sort of like fill in a pseudo procedural way this whole grid. There's weird stuff you can do with this if you're sort of like being clever about how you're setting things up. In this case, I'm just going to go with scatter. And the beautiful thing about MASH is like it works if, ooh, that was aggressive. It works if there's hills and mountains and plains, and you can see that the trees are just sort of going with the rest of the mesh, which is really, really handy. It's, again, great way to sort of like populate trees up a mountainside. It gets a little weird. Normally this setting is what I want, but in the case of trees and or other plants, the fact that they are now slanted very aggressively on the side of this hill looks ridiculous. So there's more options where you can sort of like turn that off. In this case, Still in the distribute, you can turn off calculate rotation. Basically what this does is it tries to match the rotation to sort of, it's a combination of the normals of the mesh, so it's going to point your object straight out from the mesh, as well as, I realized this the other day, it's partially dependent on UVs, but in this case you can just turn that off, and you'll notice the trees are pointing straight up, but now they're all sort of facing the exact same direction, so if you're like looking at it from this direction, it's very obvious this is one tree just copied perpetually up this hill. So there's other stuff that you can do to sort of change that later and fix that. So far, anybody have any questions about any of this? Cool. So there's two other things that I thought were like kind of helpful. If you ever need a tree, say, again, on every single vertice on this mesh, what you can do is actually, this only works if you're doing like face center or vertices, it'll pull up the option for flood mesh. Basically, this is just going to be like, hey, anywhere there's a free face, ooh, okay. I was expecting it to break the computer. It's just going to put a tree on it. So it's a very convenient way to just like automatically populate something with trees if you don't mind a very aggressive grid shape. You can also, there's some other settings. I'll show you those in a minute. I'll show you the sort of interesting snake scale thing because I think that was actually like a pretty cool thing that was like interesting to do. So we have our janky trees, and this is at this point pretty much as we can do with this distribute node in terms of actually making them look, you know, semi-natural across this landscape. So what we want to do now is add in some other things, or other nodes to this MASH network. So if we click on this MASH1 or this MASH network, you see there's a bunch of different random options and stuff that you can add. I'm not going to go through a lot of these. You can actually use MASH to sort of, if you're ever looking to make like a flock of birds that are like sort of flapping their wings, you can use that to sort of automate their wings to flap at different times. MASH is really, really powerful. I'm mostly just going to show you the stuff for populating objects. So what we want in this case is a random node. This is going to allow you, so if you just click on that, it'll pull up this like little button for add random. Just click on that. Did you add the thing? If it added the thing, it should show up down here. I think it, there we go. Cool. Oh wait, no, what? Hang on. Okay, that's dumb. Cool. This did not refresh, so I just refreshed that. But basically this allows you to add a little bit of variation to either translate, rotate, or scale, or all of them. By default, and I don't really know why this is the default, it's like, hey, let's make stuff float. That would make sense. It starts out with a default random of basically anywhere from 0 to 1 units on the X, Y, and Z translation of the object. In this case, I don't really want that because these are already randomly scattered across the scene, and especially for like position Y, it's going to be like, hey, do you want these trees randomly floating? Now this could be cool for like some floating crystals or something like that. Maybe you wanted to do like a slight strange pulsing motion. In this case, I do not want floating trees. So what we're interested in is two things, sort of rotation and scale. So we'll start with rotation first. So again, if we're looking at these trees, they're very, very clearly rotated the same direction. So what we can do is go through and we could maybe make some of them lean a little bit. It might sort of help sell this illusion a little bit. But what we really want to play with is probably the rotation Y. And we're just going to bump that up to the max setting. And you can see, like, as we did that, it makes the trees, whereas when that was set to nothing, it's very, very obvious. Like, again, same tree, just duplicated a bajillion times. But now it's, like, a little bit less obvious. And you can sort of, like, play with these values to find something you're happy with. You can also go through and play with the seed. The seed value is basically just, it uses like a random number in calculation. So changing, sort of like calculate how the rotation or the randomness is generated. By choosing a different seed, you just get a different random pattern that is generated. So you can kind of play with this a little bit. to see if there's like a particular layout of these trees that you prefer. You can also go through and again mess with the scale of the mess with the scale of the trees a little bit. So in this case, let's do something like really strange. So you can see again we have now differently sized trees. In this case, every once in a while it does something super weird where it makes like a really bizarre sort of stretchy tree like this. If that's not what you want, you should be good to turn on this sort of uniform scale button. And what that's going to do is it's going to say, hey, I'm going to basically scale all of the axes on a number. So if you're looking at like a scale of 2.6, it's going to scale everything, like every axis, 2.6 times higher instead of, modifying them all individually. So if you don't want your object stretched, you do want to turn on this uniform scale button. And then you can go through and play with some more stuff within this random node. So randomness strength, 0 is basically turned off. 1 is at full, and then you can mess again with sort of the strength of the randomness. So sometimes if you set that down lower, it's usually you'll get like 1 or 2 like really sort of large aggressive objects, and much sort of less sort of like dynamic results, if that makes sense. But yeah, that's pretty much MASH and the sort of random node for populating trees. It might not be a bad idea if you're doing this to make like 2 or 3 trees and just sort of like run this separately so that you have a little bit of variation within there. You can also use different types of trees, but you can, if you want to, apply the same. I will make cones. You can apply multiple meshes to the same sort of base mesh. So I made this cone, sad little cone, and I'm just going to, again, go into my mesh, make a separate mesh network. Not a bad idea to label these trees, especially if you're doing like a bunch of them in your scene, but that should give you, again, another little just default, here's a line of 10 cones. Set this to mesh, and again, you should be good to just drag in your ground plane again. And you can see that now you have a little bit more variation in your trees, or now the ground has giant spikes in it. So again, you can totally do multiple trees on the same mesh. That shouldn't be an issue. And the beautiful thing about MASH is that, again, if you decide you want to sort of tweak your ground a little bit, you can just move that and your trees will automatically get carried with it, which is very, very convenient. You can also really, really easily swap in other meshes. If you decide, like, oops, my ground plane, I redid my entire ground plane, I don't want to set up my MASH networks again, go into your distribute and just drag whatever new mesh you want, and it should populate all of your trees onto this strange little world of trees. Kind of looks like hair. But yeah. So that honestly should be all you need to sort of set up sort of trees or bushes or like random grasses with MASH. There's other sort of weird fancy stuff you can do with animation on those things, but I think I'll probably save that for a sort of later class. Does anybody have any questions on any of this? Cool. I do want to show you a weird, just like, again, really, really weird, silly thing that you can do, which you may or may not ever have a use for again. But it is, I think, kind of cool and handy to know that you can do this. Oh my God, what am I doing? Okay, hang on. So I'm just going to take my ground plane, and this might be handy if you were doing like a roof and you wanted to use MASH to automatically shingle your roof or something similar to this. In this case, it's actually what I use to add scales to the snake and get like a nice sort of grid pattern. So I'm just going to make a extremely ugly looking auto creation. I'm going to make like the world's ugliest scale really quick. It's going to be really janky. Yay, it is a scale, guys. All right, it's beautiful. Nobody questioned how ugly this is. All right, so we have our scale. Great. And again, this would totally work for stuff like shingles or like anything you need an offset pattern to. So right now, if we make a mesh network for the scale, and we go into our distribute node, thank you, mesh, all right, and hook up our ground plane like we did before, you'll notice a few things maybe. So for one, I'm just going to take this scale and I'm just going to like stick it off to the side so we can see what's happening with it. So if you scale your original object or you modify your original object in any way, for one, that's going to modify however it looks on your mesh network. So that is also very, very handy. But you'll notice sort of at least one thing that this has done that's like a little bit strange. Originally, our scale is pointed downwards or like facing the positive Z. All of the ones on the mesh network are basically pointing left. And this, I just realized this the other day, is because of how the UVs are set up, which is super weird. But if you ever want to change that, basically, so if I just grab some random UVs like on this sort of side of the mesh, you can see that that's the direction it's pointing sort of like corresponds to these UVs that I'm selecting. If you rotate this UV shell, it will change the direction that these scales are pointing. So if you're ever having issues with your objects like flipping around or like pointing in a strange direction, literally just change the UV mesh if that's like a thing that reasonably you can do, and that will affect the rotation of these scales. I found that was sort of the easiest way to do this, assuming you didn't have a bunch of crazy textures and stuff already set up for your object. Mostly just a weird note. All right, so now that these are pointing in I'm just going to call this like the correct direction. I am going to go through and, again, if this is like scales or like a ceiling, or what am I saying, scales on a roof or scales on a snake, presumably you want the whole thing covered. So I'm just going to go ahead and set this to, I'll do face center, and I'll do flood mesh. So what this should give us is a very awkwardly sort of scaly looking ground plane. It's not ideal, obviously it breaks down around these super weird aggressive pointy areas, but it does sort of start getting the idea across. That being said, most scales or shingles are not set up in this extremely linear fashion where one is directly over each other. It'll be staggered, so you'd have normally a scale like right here kind of thing. There is a way to do that. It does involve sort of changing how your mesh behaves. So I just temporarily turned off that mesh network, and I'm going to actually modify my mesh. Firstly, I'm going to back it up because I am paranoid. But this is a really weird hack if you ever, again, need to populate something with mesh and have sort of something staggered like bricks or scales, or if you for some reason, just sort of need to make this shape. So bear with me for like 2 seconds. I'll probably run through this twice. Select all of the edges in your mesh. Go up to Create, Sets, and Quick Select Set. So basically what a Quick Select Set is, it'll just save your selection. So if you ever need to select, the same loop of edges, you just spent forever selecting a particular number of faces and you don't want to have to redo that, you could just make this Quick Select Set, hit OK, and then if I ever, deselect that for whatever reason, you should be able to go up and just select Quick Select Sets. Any that you make are going to show up here, and it'll reselect all of your edges automatically. This is going to be really important because of the thing that we're going to do in the next 2 seconds, and that is we're going to poke the mesh. The tool is literally called Poke. Select your mesh, go to Edit Mesh, and towards the bottom there is this lovely option, which I did promise was called Poke. Poke your mesh. And you can see it's gone through and basically more or less tessellated it, but what it's done is basically put a cross through each of your faces. On its own, this is not the most helpful thing, but if we go and then we grab our quick select set for edges, it'll select all of your original edges from the mesh, and then you can just control delete them. And instead what you're left with is basically this sort of reverse grid, or like sort of diagonal grid instead of the original geometry. So you see, like, here is the original mesh versus the new mesh. So I've used this to model strawberries before, but it is, again, really bizarrely handy for making sort of crosshatchy things in MASH. So theoretically, oh sweet, it worked. So it updated changing the geometry updated how the MASH displayed, and you can see that now the scales are laid out in a little bit better pattern, where they're sort of, again, you have like one scale that's sort of like feathered in between the other two instead of like that really strange linear layout before. So this is actually, that looks terrible. But this is actually how I sort of, again, populated a bunch of scales on a snake. I just made a big squiggle and then poked the snake to sort of change the way the edge loops were running, and then just populated scales with MASH. So it literally did do like 1,000 scales in 20 minutes, and it was glorious. So this is like, again, just sort of super handy. Also works for different stuff like, you know, tiled roofs, like I said. I know some of you guys are doing miscellaneous, like, no, sorry, there's someone's doing like a really fancy like New Orleans model. That's what I was thinking when I said roofs. But you can go through and then be like, oh, I'm not quite happy with the shape of this. Let me sort of, you know, move the tip up maybe so that these are a little bit tiled, like a little bit sort of more aggressively. So MASH gives you a lot of freedom to sort of go through and smartly populate things, I guess, if you're planning ahead, especially, and can like set stuff up for your mesh. The other thing that was kind of cool, which I didn't know existed, and this mesh may not be the best to show this on. Let me do a very obnoxious thing. So if you have exceedingly differently shaped tiles or like geometries on your piece, like you can see the scales kind of break down and they no longer cover this base mesh. I'm gonna make that green. Hopefully that makes it a little bit easier to see. So one thing you can do is go in, once you've flooded the mesh, go into face and edge settings and do enable scaling. What that's gonna do, you might need to play with the value a little bit, but it's gonna sort of automatically scale these scales based on whatever the size of the face it's attached to is. So if you're looking for a really convenient way to just sort of, again, just like, oops, I need that area covered, or like towards the tail of the snake, the scale should get smaller, you can turn on the scaling and it'll sort of like automatically do that for you, which was super, super handy. But yeah. Shoot, there was like one thing that I don't remember that I was gonna show you guys. Shoot. I think, pending the one thing that I was like, oh, that would be a super great thing to show them, that I literally just forgot. Does anybody have any questions about MASH or like when you might want to use this? Okay. Cool. So this also works, just for the record, if you guys are ever, you can also use this to like lay stuff out along a curve. So if you're doing like Christmas lights or something like that, you can just sort of automatically populate a crap ton of Christmas lights on a string. Stuff like that might be handy. But yeah, that is pretty much probably most of what you would need for MASH. Shoot. Dang it, there was one thing that I'm like, that would be super, super helpful. Okay. Anywho. All right. That was actually pretty much most of what I had for you guys today. The one thing, and it's not so much a tutorial, but one thing I wanted to touch on, I had one or two people ask, basically like that their videos, they were trying to import video reference into Maya, and it wasn't working for some reason. So normally what you'd want to do is just go view, image plane, import movie, find your movie, and import it. And after spending far too much time, like 5 hours reading about this online, apparently Maya on Windows only takes AVI files, which is really dumb. But even then, sometimes the import movie option wasn't working. There is a really stupid workaround for this. It's incredibly convoluted, but it does work. Basically what you'd want to do is, you can go into like After Effects or Premiere, or even VLC will do this. Pretty much go in and render your entire video sequence or animation as an image sequence, and import that image sequence instead of the movie. So once you have that sequence, what you should do is just go into Import Image. Where did I? I'm just gonna grab like my bark. So you should just import that as normal, and then tick this little Use Image Sequence button. Basically what it's gonna do as you scrub through, frame 7, 8, it's gonna go through and sort of automatically try to pull the 8th frame in that sequence. So this should behave exactly like a movie clip, it's just a series of, a bajillion images. This is so far the only good workaround I've found to the importing video issue. The only other thing that I would like to note about this, and it is very important, apparently Maya is exceedingly picky about the formatting for the numbers of the image sequence. So when you're doing this, ensure that you have no spaces in your file names. That will apparently break things. In all my tests, that broke everything. And make sure that you don't have more than 4 frames of file frame padding in there. So basically, if you had something like, you want something like this, like 0001, 001, 1, any of these should work. If you have 00001, it will not recognize that this is a valid image sequence because Maya is insane. You can set it, you can go into your preferences and like modify documents to correct this, so it will recognize this, but as you're exporting stuff, just make sure your frame padding is set to 4 and you should be fine. So as you do this again, you're looking for sort of like file dot something like that for your file name, or file, any of these should work, and just like with whatever your extension you have at the end. That's the only caveat to doing this, but yeah, so just like whenever you're rendering out of After Effects or Premiere this image sequence, if you need to go this route, make sure that you've set it up so that your files are sort of in a format that Maya can read. Maya is nuts. The other thing, you could also theoretically use like a bulk renamer online to do this. Excuse me. But if you are working in the lab computers, you can't download stuff, so that's not really an option. Interestingly, apparently you can also bulk rename stuff in the File Explorer, which is weird and I didn't know was a thing, but like if you just grab multiple things at once and do rename, it'll automatically rename everything in sequence. This format, unfortunately, doesn't work with Maya, so it's not inherently useful. I just thought it was kind of cool. But yeah, so that's the sort of silly workaround I found if you can't get your video format stuff to import. I was pretty lenient because I realized that was an issue on the first steps assignment, so I was kind of just like, eh. But going forward, it is important to actually, put your reference in Maya when you're animating real things for your final. So if any of you guys are having issues with that, or like if you find some crazy magical workaround that allows you to import stuff better, please do let me know. But this is, after 5 hours of research online, the best that I could come up with, which makes me sad, but it does work. So, yeah, that's pretty much that. Anybody have any questions about that, or like notice any other weird issues with that? Cool. Any other questions about anything else we went over today? All right. In that case, it looks like I'm letting you out a little bit early. I'm going to hang around if anyone has questions about rigging or whatever. We can just do open lab, but I'm not going to require that you guys stay for that. But yeah, next week, happy work in progress animations. Let me know if stuff is exploding with rigs still. Have a lovely week. Something. Words. Ah.